housing crisis in San Francisco has hit people of color the hardest. This is not just a result of the current market or rising rent. It comes from decades of city policies that limited access to housing, loans, and public resources for Black, Latino, and other communities of color. For this project titled Race and Housing in San Francisco, my primary stakeholder is the Bay Area Council Economic Institute. My secondary specific stakeholder is the Mission Economic Development Agency, which works to prevent the displacement of Latino families in the Mission District. Other relevant stakeholders include the San Francisco Planning Department and community-based housing organizations. BACEI must use an anti-racist approach when analyzing San Francisco's housing system because their policy recommendations influence displacement within the race and housing fault line, and must support the needs of organizations like MEDA working to protect communities harmed by historic racism. Kendi argues that racism comes from policies and institutions, and BACEI must use this idea when analyzing San Francisco's housing system. According to Kendi, the housing crisis is not random. Policies and planning decisions made decades ago produce today's inequalities. BACEI cannot treat housing only as a market problem. Instead, they need to analyze how city and federal policies have helped some groups and hurt others. Applying this to BACEI means their reports and recommendations should evaluate whether policies repair historic harms or reinforce them. This supports the thesis that anti-racist solutions are necessary. Merrow et al. Show that colorism and racial discrimination in the labor market make housing insecurity worse, and BACEI should include this in their analyses. According to Merrow et al., discrimination in employment, especially colorism and racial bias, affects income stability and access to housing. This shapes how BACEI should understand the housing crisis, because wages influence who can remain housed in San Francisco. If BACEI ignores racialized labor inequalities, their economic models underestimate the risks faced by marginalized communities. Connecting this to the thesis, BACEI must include race-conscious labor data to make anti-racist recommendations. Liu and Lester Jones argue that relying on raw numbers without context can worsen racial inequality, and BACEI must avoid this. According to Liu and Lester Jones, relying on numbers without context can cause institutions to withdraw resources from the communities that need them the most. This matters for BACEI because their reports often rely heavily on quantitative data for policy recommendations. Without context, their analysis could unintentionally justify unequal distribution of resources. Connecting this to the thesis, BACEI must interpret data through an anti-racist lens so their recommendations acknowledge the history behind current disparities. Beltran et al. Show that intersectional discrimination increases housing instability, and BACEI must include this in their policy analysis. According to Beltran et al., people with multiple marginalized identities face higher levels of housing instability than those with a single marginalization. BACEI should use that data that shows which groups are most vulnerable. This means targeting policies towards people who face layered discrimination rather than applying a one-size-fits-all approach. This supports the thesis by showing that anti-racist, equity-focused policies are necessary. BACEI must rethink what they measure so that their research supports fairness and does not worsen inequality. According to regional housing data used by BACEI, Their decisions shape policies across the Bay Area. If they only focus on economic metrics, they may overlook the communities that need the support the most. By including race-divided data, BACEI can show which groups actually benefit from proposed policies. Modeling different scenarios makes it possible to see which policies keep long-term residents in their neighborhood. This supports the thesis by demonstrating how BACEI can reduce racial disparities through anti-racist analysis. Mission Economic Development Agency has a direct stake in preventing displacement in the Mission District, and their community work makes their perspective essential for understanding the race and housing fault line. According to Navarro et al., lived experience often reveals discrimination patterns that broad datasets miss. MEDA documents these patterns through their work with families experiencing eviction threats, rising rents, and displacement pressures in the Mission. Their interest within the race and housing fault line is to keep long-term Latino residents housed and prevent further loss of community stability. When BACEI creates policy recommendations, integrating MEDA's community-level data ensures that anti-racist solutions respond to the real conditions shaping housing insecurity. Connecting this to the thesis, MEDA's insights show why BACEI must use an anti-racist framework that centers the needs of organizations working to repair historic racial harms. The Planning Department must change zoning and land use policies to undo historic racial exclusion. According to research on racial disparities in urban planning, zoning policies have historically excluded communities of color from certain neighborhoods. For the Planning Department, this means reforms must account for how current land use structures continue these patterns. BACEI's role is to provide economic evidence showing that equity-focused zoning changes are workable. This supports the thesis by linking structural reform to anti-racist policy making. Philanthropy, developers, and community organizations must work together with BACEI to scale fair housing solutions. According to policy studies on equitable development, no single sector can repair racialized housing disparities alone. Philanthropy can reduce financial risk, developers can build affordable units, and community organizations ensure resources reach marginalized populations. BACEI's analyses can help align these groups by showing which strategies reduce displacement most effectively. This supports the thesis by emphasizing coordinated, anti-racist approaches. To solve the housing crisis, the city must treat it as a result of racist policies and implement reparative, anti-racist solutions. According to the evidence shown throughout the project, policy decisions, labor discrimination, decontextualized metrics, and intersectional harms all contribute to housing insecurity for people of color. BACEI should use anti-racist frameworks, equity-weighted modeling, and intersectional data to propose reparative policies. These actions can reduce the racial disparities at the center of San Francisco's housing crisis. Thank you for watching my final project, a digital short titled Race and Housing in San Francisco for Professor Navarro's Writing 1 class.